that's how up Schitt's Creek they were by the time I got on board. They had a full studio up and running. They had animators from all over the world working. The director was directing, and they had no script. There was a tremendous amount of pressure. So it was a really strange assignment. While I did my best to bring my emotional game to it, it also had a tremendous practical element for a writer.
Welcome to Script Apart, a podcast about the first draft secrets of great movies. Each episode, we speak to a brilliant screenwriter who's kindly dug out their initial screenplay for what became a beloved movie, discussing what changed, what didn't, and why, from first draft to the big screen. In this very special Halloween episode, we're going to be stepping inside a ghoulish, gothic holiday musical that's enchanted millions since its release 27 years ago. I'm talking, of course, about The Nightmare Before Christmas, the timeless twisted tale of a pumpkin king named Jack Skellington and his ragdoll friend Sally. Our guest this week, Caroline Thompson, wrote the film's screenplay based on a poem by producer Tim Burton and songs by the composer Danny Elfman. Caroline came on board the project at an eventful time. Things hadn't worked out with another screenwriter, and with production already underway, it was up to Caroline to turn a loose story into a living, breathing script, with a convincing love interest for Jack Skellington. The pressures facing Caroline, Tim Burton, and director Henry Selick led to a frenzied creative environment where, as you'll discover in this episode, tempers often flared. It was worth it though. Animated movies don't come much more beloved than the deliriously imaginative Nightmare Before Christmas. Here's Caroline on her chaotic experience making the movie, why she'll always have a place in her heart for Frankensteinian sweetheart Sally, why she fought but failed to change the villainous Oogie Boogie, and the likelihood of a Nightmare Before Christmas sequel ever seeing the light of day. You're listening to Script Apart, hosted by me, Al Horner, produced by Camille Demek. Hi, Caroline. Welcome to Script Apart. How are you today?
I'm well, Al. Thank you. Really nice to meet you. Thanks so much for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. The Nightmare Before Christmas is such an enduring story that people have so much attachment to. Can you tell me about your relationship with the film today, the emotions it conjures for you each year approaching wintertime as people begin celebrating this film anew?
Well, it's rather odd, to be quite frank. Nightmare Before Christmas was not terribly successful at the box office when it was first released. And to be honest, I did not really pay attention to it, short of the annual invitation to the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland, which I've never attended, but actually, and can't this year, but would really like to at some point. But then I was in Sitges at the film festival outside Barcelona several years ago promoting a film, and an interviewer asked me, how does it feel to have written the most beloved cult movie on the planet? I had no idea what movie he was talking about. So I said, well, I asked him what he was talking about, and it was Nightmare Before Christmas, which I thought was enormously enchanting. And I noticed later when I went to visit my cousin in Barcelona after the film festival that in the plaza there was a gigantic Jack Skellington on stilts. And I soon learned that there are Jack Skellington stilt walkers all over the world. It just kind of blows me away. And I still see people wearing Jack or Sally sweatshirts and whatnot. It kind of amazes me. I think it's fabulous.
Yeah, and that adoration, it stretches across generations. You've got people who grew up with the film, who love Jack Skellington. You've got people who weren't even born when the movie was released, who loved Jack Skellington. What do you put the longevity of this film down to? What is it that's resonated so incredibly with generation after generation?
I have no idea, to be honest. I suppose it's the sense, all the stories that I write are about not belonging and not feeling part of the community. Either feeling responsible for it like Jack does, or hidden away from it like Sally felt before she escaped. And I do think that those are very strong feelings in every human. We somehow feel, imperious about being here, but also uneasy and as if we don't belong.
It sounds like that's a sort of screenwriting philosophy or a storytelling philosophy that you've had for a long time, because there's a quote of yours I love. So you once said that all your stories are basically the same story. They're animal stories, literally in some cases, metaphorically in most. What does it feel like when the world is not made for you and you're basically expected to simply slot in? When the table is so high you can only see the bottom. Those are my stories. I love that quote. What do you think led you to that philosophy? Is it just that there's something so emotional and so human and relatable about stories about outsiders?
I was born into sort of a chaotic family, as I think many of us are. And I mean, my mom had 3 children under the age of 4 at one point, which when I imagine that, and she was young herself, she had me when she was 27 and my brother when she was 23. It's just unimaginable to me and her parents were next door and she took care of them. I mean, I don't know how she coped even as successfully as she did, but I do know that to succeed or survive in that configuration, it was required that one just slot in, which I was not very good at. I created a bit of chaos, I think. But at any rate, I think that a lot of us are born into families where that's how we feel.
Yeah, that chimes with what Tim Burton has described about the movie. He's often said that the character was born out of like his childhood in Burbank and a sense of loneliness that he grew up with. So yeah, I'm kind of interested to know, can you remember at what point in those early years it was that you started to kind of gravitate towards storytelling and maybe started fooling around writing stories of your own?
I remember it exactly. It was in 6th grade and I wrote a short story that moved my classmates to tears.
Wow.
And the swell of the addiction of that was probably what got me started. It was a story of I grew up in Washington, D.C., and it was a story of a blind flower vendor in Georgetown who didn't see the traffic when he was called across the street to bring a bouquet, got killed, and all that was left behind was the precious gold watch on a chain that he had worn in his vest. Everybody just wept. It was fabulous. The next story was about a woman with a brain tumor. I think I would have been a lot more successful screenwriter in terms of commercial success if I'd written my scripts when I was 12 years old. I had such a melodramatic and silly and straightforward sensibility. And I figured out what worked, You
did. That's interesting because I had read of this sort of transformative summer for you. I think you were around 16 and you were living in England and you were in a house full of what you described as kind of creepy paintings. And it was around this time that you saw A Clockwork Orange for the first time. And I had assumed that maybe that was sort of this transformative time where something awoke in you and that's when you started to develop your love for these sort of sensibilities. But it sounds like you already kind of were gravitating towards those themes and a slight darkness before this point.
That summer was certainly when I fell in love with language and words. And I mean, I fell in love with, I strangely as a child, even though I grew up in a house of books, I was not really a reader. All I ever wanted to do was be on a pony. So, which is funny because I'm not an athlete, but there's something about that animal that has always held me in its thrall. But yes, we spent a summer in Islington, renting the home of a journalist called Connor Cruz O'Brien. And his interior design sense was far more radical than any I'd ever been around. The walls were painted purple and the art on the walls was literally 3-dimensional, which I'd never even imagined was a thing. And he had an entire bookcase of Penguin paperbacks. I think he probably owned every single Penguin paperback published. And I, to my mother and everyone's dismay, preferred to stay home and read through this collection of amazing books rather than go to Coventry Cathedral or whatnot. So basically I spent my days reading Penguin paperbacks. I read Fitzgerald, Faulkner, Hemingway, all that stuff for the first time. And then in my evenings, I would go to Piccadilly and, do drugs and pick up boys. It was, I discovered those things that summer too. It was really, truly transformative and has made me feel a tremendous kinship to London. When I first went back, so that was the summer of 1972 that we spent in Islington. When I first spent any time again in London was when we were making Secret Garden, and the hotel we stayed in was on Leicester Square, and outside in Leicester Square, all the kids were singing Beatles songs, just like they had been all those years earlier. It was literally a feeling of coming home.
Wow. That's the sort of thing that when I see in films, like it cuts to London and there's a big Union Jack flying and people are singing Beatles songs, I'm always like, does that really happen? But I guess it does actually happen.
Well, it did. I'm here to tell you, and I'm sorry for you not to have experienced it, because it was fucking fabulous.
So we talked a moment ago about animal stories. How does Jack Skellington fit into that mold? How is Nightmare Before Christmas an animal story about someone trying to fit into a world that they don't quite belong?
It's really hard for me to speak to the character of Jack because, as I'm sure you've read, my relationship to the project was a little bit coming through the back door, which is to say, I was not the first writer hired on the project. I had a romantic relationship with Danny Elfman at that time, and he happened to be living at my home because his house was undergoing a renovation. So he was writing the songs for Nightmare in my house. I was not the writer, much to my dismay, and so I overheard the work he was doing, and I saw how he was developing the character of Jack. And in fact, by the time I was brought onto the project, because the first writer had been a disappointment, this character of Jack was fully, not just developed, fully expressed, and his arc was there. Everything about him was there, pretty much. So, I was, okay, now what can I contribute? And the character of Sally was completely unimagined when I got there. She was designed. She looked sort of like Corpse Bride later looked. She was very Zoftig, which is a physical character that it was really hard for me to understand. And so I asked Rick Heinrichs, who was designing the sets and the characters, if we could lean her a little bit more toward the Little Match Girl, which is a character I do understand. And Frankenstein is a character for whom I have tremendous love. Sally, actually, though, in terms of animals, strangely, through working with the storyboard artist, through working through her, she mutated over the course of production. She became very much like a spider. She became someone who had a lot of stratagems and plans and was cunning and probably smarter than any of us, which is, I think spiders probably are. Mm-hmm. And but that's really literal. The emotional part about being an animal that always draws me is a sense of the miracle of communication. And I think it's a miracle between humans, but I certainly think it's a miracle between animals and humans. And many of my dogs have wanted desperately to belong. And so I see in them that feeling that I also shared as a kid. So I suppose that's really, what I mean by all my stories are animal stories. We're all looking for our spot on the earth, in our culture, in our community, in our neighborhood, in our homes. And animals really embody that for me. They express that so clearly and so sincerely.
That's a really nice way of putting it. And I want to go back to something you said a moment ago. You mentioned, much to your dismay, you weren't the writer. So Tim wrote Nightmare Before Christmas first as a poem in 1983. it then
which I never read, by the way. I never saw that poem.
Really? So what was it when you say your dismay? What kind of relationship did you have to this story? Did you hear about it through Danny? And why was it that you were so upset that you weren't the person in charge of bringing this to screen?
Well, it was in the mythology. Everybody had heard about the poem Tim wrote, if not seen it. Well, Tim and I had just done Edwards Scissorhands, and our relationship was really, really good when we first were friends, and struggled through time. And I felt and feel to this day that I'm his best writer and he's my best director, even though he literally did not direct Night Before Christmas. Our sensibilities are incredibly akin, and so it's a sadness for me that we haven't worked together more. And so it wasn't really dismay. I guess that was overstated. It was just sort of like, well, what about me? It was more feelings of being, the kid who's going like, wait a minute, I'm here too. So that's more what it felt like. But I was, it's a business that if you're going to survive in it, you need to be a sincere realist. So I'm sure I took it with that cheerful realism with which I take most things.
Sure. Me too. Yeah, but I can imagine sort of like looking on with a sense of envy, especially having worked with Tim before, because
it wasn't envy though.
Not envy.
Envy is too strong. It was just a sense of being left out, which later informed Sally enormously.
But what I mean is, I can imagine sort of like looking at the project from afar and thinking, wow, there's so much rich material there to kind of work with and shape. Because Nightmare Before Christmas kind of, it strides both Halloween and the festive periods, two periods that obviously sit near each other in the calendar, but tonally and emotionally sit so far apart. Halloween is this time of creepiness and fear, Christmas one of joy and togetherness. Was that part of what kind of attracted you to the project?
So you say.
Well, theoretically it should be. I can't speak for all families. But yeah, was that kind of part of what attracted you to the project? This idea of being able to tonally do something really interesting by colliding the emotions and traditions of both Halloween and Christmas?
Well, that would be wonderful, but it actually isn't terribly accurate, because by the time I got to the project, it was like trying to build a house people were already living in. It was really like, what the hell can I do with the gaps that I, where can I find the gaps that I can write a script around? Because as I said, Danny, he told Jack's story. So as I've indicated, my goal was to tell Sally's story. And so that's the character I focused on, that and the mayor. And, I sort of built the world around, Lock, Shock, and Barrel existed. They were in fact animating their song when I was hired to write the script. That's how up Schitt's Creek they were by the time I got on board. They had a full studio up and running. They had animators from all over the world working. The director was directing, and they had no script. So there was a tremendous amount of pressure, but I didn't really feel it. I thought, well, okay, and Tim didn't offer me the project, by the way. It was the president of Disney Studios who offered me the project, David Hoberman. And so when he called, I said, well, let me think about it. And I thought, well, what's left to contribute? And so a couple of images came to me. One was of Sally, who, being stitched together resonates as a Frankensteinian character. Frankensteinian, whatever, character. And so I had this visual image of her throwing herself out of the balcony in which she'd been entrapped by her overbearing parent, creator, and fell to the ground and was unharmed, except that her various body parts went everywhere and she had to stitch herself back together again. I thought, oh, well, that's really cool. And then I had the other image of when and again, it's a use of the Frankenstein quality. She unstitches her leg and leaves it to tempt Oogie Boogie while she goes and releases Sandy Claus. So, and the structure of the story, I think, was sort of, I did not invent Oogie Boogie. I didn't invent him kidnapping Santa Claus. That's in the Lock, Shock, and Barrel song, for example. So those are the payoffs I needed to aim for. So it was a really strange assignment. While I did my best to bring my emotional game to it, it also had a tremendous practical element for a writer.
I'm sure, yeah. So what was it?
Your great animator, Nick Park, is the only person that I've ever read who said, something's really wrong with that movie. It doesn't feel like it coheres. And he's absolutely right. It was built in a very peculiar manner.
So just to kind of go back a little bit over the history, it actually stretches back quite far. As I mentioned, the poem was written in 1983. Tim was at Disney for a while trying to get the project made, but they were holding firm, saying that it was too weird and too dark. He's in fact said that Disney was unable to offer his nocturnal loners enough scope, which is a wonderfully Tim Burton way of putting it.
Tim said that?
Yeah.
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
The problem with the prior script was there was no script. None. Not a word. The writer who'd been hired was, bless him and God rest his soul, the Beetlejuice writer called Michael McDowell, and he wrote nothing. And when the due date came, he panicked and he took Danny's lyrics and formatted them as if they were script. And that's literally what he turned in.
Gosh, wow.
So that's what I mean by they were up Schitt's Creek. I mean, there was just nothing.
How had it come together then? Had Tim sat down and sort of broken the back of the story with Danny, and then is that kind of how that's the script or the sort of story structure that you were handed? Is that how that had been formed?
To be honest, I don't know. I presume so. I wasn't there. It's funny. So I lived in Burbank at the time. There's a funny little community there where I don't live there now, but we keep horses in our gardens there. Sort of, I don't know if you know the American kids television show from the 50s called Mr. Ed.
No.
Well, it's about a horse that lives in somebody's garden. And that's my neighborhood. That was the inspiration for Mr. Ed. So when Tim would come over for story meetings with Danny, and I had an assistant at the time who was a very tall and striking former model who had been a longtime waitress at a fancy LA restaurant, who was a tremendously good cook because she knew all their recipes. So Tim and Danny would be sitting in my garden at the table, and Amy, my assistant, would appear with a towel over her arm and pass out her beautiful lunch and pour them wine or whatever. I don't think either of them drank, but you know what I mean. She would just create this wonderful atmosphere. And Tim turned to Danny one day and said, "I don't get it. I've got all the money, but Caroline's got the great life." But which is, my obsession is to create a life worth living. But so I don't know. I was not there at those initial meetings. And Danny's a very sort of, hermetic creator. And so he would just go into his studio, which was in one of the rooms of my house, and work on his songs. I never really heard anything, but I heard the various songs. I mean, he did not write the Sally songs. That's what he wrote after the script that I turned in. But pretty much all the songs, I think, were written. It's hard to remember. It was quite a while ago.
Hey everyone, this is Al. Just wanted to jump in with a quick shout out to our sponsors this week, Cave Day. Revising scripts requires supreme focus. The best writers know they need to harness everything they've got to overcome internal and external obstacles. Cave Day lead group focus sessions for a worldwide community every day on Zoom. Think of it like a group fitness class, but for your work. A trained guide leads check-ins, deep work sprints, and energizing breaks. Members report they get 2 to 4 times more done with Cave Day's science-backed method. Join the world's most focused community and work alongside Emmy winners and Oscar winners. Script Apart listeners can try a free 3-hour cave with promo code ScriptApart, that's all uppercase, at checkout. Head to caveday.org to try it out. That's caveday.org. Okay, back to the conversation. So what was it about when you came on board that made you realise this character of Sally needs to be fleshed out and there needs to be more of her presence in the film?
Well, I didn't really have a choice. There wasn't any other character left of significance to examine. I mean, as I said, Danny just he took Jack, ran with him, nailed him, told the story. If I had told some of that story in script as well, it would have simply been redundant. So I needed to find another way into Jack. Essentially, since Jack is the protagonist, I needed to find a fresh way into Jack, and I think the mayor also contributes to that way into Jack. But Sally is certainly the primary conduit, and but her goal, she's got separate goals from just wanting to be near Jack. I mean, she's growing up and she's changing and she's seeking independence, and I think maybe that's another reason why children especially are drawn to that part of the story, because that's, a kid chafes against restriction. As much as a kid wants to be included, a kid also wants freedom.
And it's important, as you say, that this was a character who felt real, who had her own goals, and although she was secretly in love with Jack, she didn't exist. She wasn't just something in Jack's orbit. She had her own personality. That seems important, and also sort of quite rare then, and to be honest, quite rare now.
Well, I think if I were writing her now, I would give her even more of her own self. Those were slightly different times. But yes, it was clearly important to me for Sally to be her own prime mover and have her own goals and own motivations and own struggles. And
at what point in the process did you start to think and start to realize, okay, wow, there may be these characters, Sally, Jack, they have the potential to go on and sort of become enduring characters that people love across the world, that, yes, as you mentioned, people will be impersonating on stilts in 25 years' time and so on?
Well, I was so in it, I don't think I realized at the time. I mean, to be perfectly honest, did not get a tremendous amount of encouragement from anybody other than the brilliant storyboard artist Joe Ramp, also rest his soul, with whom I worked quite closely. So I would go up to the studio, it was in San Francisco, and I would fly up perhaps once a month. And the storyboard artist would would break down the scenes, because stop motion animation, as I'm sure you know, is so arduous. You literally do not want to shoot an unnecessary gesture. So they were a key to the success of the storytelling, and so I would they would make adjustments, I would make adjustments, we would figure things out together. It was their animation of Sally's movements that really expanded my understanding of her spideriness. They sort of had her on all fours, moving this way and that, for example. But Henry Selick was a very stressed out character and told me I'd ruined his movie, and waited to speak for years. And Tim, I don't know, it was toward the end of work, and I made the taboo suggestion that perhaps we might want to go back into the story and look at the ending again. I'm still not happy with that ending. I'm not sure what I would have done, but Tim blew up at me and had a cow and tried to tear apart a flatbed editing bay in his fury. When I wrote the script, Danny said, he was the first person to read it. He said, "This isn't good. I don't think that this is what you should have done." I was like, so it's not really very fun being a writer in Hollywood. I have to say, you spend a lot of time bucking up your own self-confidence, because you want to be able to listen, but you also want to be able to trust your gut and say, no, this works, or oh, maybe it doesn't. So I was just too close to have any, but I'm also not of a personality to go like, oh, brilliant, I've put it out in the world. And, that's not my personality at all. And as you may have read, Disney was afraid of the film. They thought it was too dark for children. And Danny had a 5-year-old daughter who obsessively marched around the house singing those songs. So I knew they were wrong, but they didn't know they were wrong. So they actually released it under their adult label of Touchstone. They did not release it as a Disney film.
That's right, yeah.
Its success took everybody by surprise, I think.
To sort of delve into the beginning of the film, that sort of balance between terror and something that's still palatable for children is really evident in the first scene. We have this like graveyard procession. We're pulled into Halloween Town. You're introduced to all these monsters hiding under your bed, hiding under your stairs. It didn't shy away from the scariness, despite all the kind of like resistance from Disney and all the worry from Disney that this was going to be a film that would potentially traumatize children. So how tricky was it?
That was Danny unleashing his essential self. That's a question for him, really, because he wrote that song. I'm not sure I would have written that song, but that's him.
Were there any things that were in there that were too dark, that you ended up sort of pulling back on? Are you aware?
No.
Wow.
Nothing.
Just totally trusted in the fact that kids can handle more than, adults sometimes believe they can. And there's a joy sometimes. I mean, when I think back to like when I was a kid and some of the things that I loved, this film included, that terrified. I mean, they scared the shit out of me. It was job done. Yeah, can you tell me a little bit about sort of like your, I guess, like philosophy regarding sort of like what kids can handle and why it's sometimes healthy as a child to be scared because the world outside is scary?
Well, I think I imagine that the original Grimm's fairy tales and how elemental they were and how Cinderella's foot was cut off and I mean they were very vivid in their violence and I think that what came later for my generation of children with the Disneyfication of Grimm's fairy tales was the more dishonest thing, trying to protect us because I think children have an instinct at how actually terrifying the world is, and if you deny it, you're going to make their fear worse rather than if you allow them to express it. So I think that Nightmare, if it has any skill in that area, is allowing kids the expression of all those fears and feelings. I mean, I imagine there are kids who don't respond to it. I have a 4-year-old granddaughter through marriage, and she carries around Day of the Dead puppets all the time. She obsessively watches Nightmare. But her older sister, dresses in pink and does ballet around the house. So kids are different, and some kids need it weird. Maybe you're one of them.
Busted. We're introduced to Jack. It's Halloween, and we are introduced to him as this like Prince of Halloween Town. Characters sort of fawn over him, sort of they admire him, they tell him he makes moons ooze and flesh crawl in a good way, obviously. But as the film goes on, you kind of pull back the layers to the character and you show this dissatisfaction that he has. He yearns for something more, and he isn't quite sure what that is, but he knows he wants more, and there's a boredom there almost.
Yeah, well, again, that's sort of, I think this is, these are Danny's issues. Danny was a really successful in California rock and roll star. He fronted a very popular band, and I think he had the "is this all there is" feeling about life as a coveted, beloved, fawned over, screamed about. I mean, I went to a concert of his. The girls and the whole place just erupted and shrieking, and I mean all that stuff. And I think he found it wanting, and I think that his exploration of Jack is about that. Is about feeling that okay, so hooray for my popularity, but where's my life? So I think that really is a description of his his emotional core.
And in terms of the place that character journeys to and transforms into, like people argue about whether Nightmare is a Halloween film, a Christmas film, or both. But it's interesting how your screenplay, in the way that has Jack go on this journey of transformation, almost the way that Scrooge experiences that sort of total transformation, it really does kind of tick a lot of the same boxes as classic Christmas narratives. Did you have kind of Christmas movies that you were thinking about, that you had in mind?
I wish I could say yes, but I did not. My favorite movie, though, also bridges Halloween and Christmas, my favorite holiday movie to watch, which is a Vincent Minnelli film called Meet Me in St. Louis.
Yeah.
Where, now that I think of it, there's a huge set piece around Halloween and a huge set piece around Christmas, both of which revolve not just around Judy Garland, but around a young child, the youngest of the family, called Tootie, played by Margaret O'Brien, that miraculous child actor of the 40s. And so maybe they're all linked in my head. I don't know. But that's the film I go to at Christmas time. But it does, other than the fact that that film has both holidays in it, I can't really track a connection for you. But who knows what's in there.
As the film goes on, we have Jack wandering in the woods the morning after Halloween. He stumbles across 7 trees containing doors to towns representing various holidays.
Yeah, that's pretty emblematic and mythological, isn't
it? Yeah. So he opens the door to Christmas Town and he's just bowled over. He's completely awed by everything he sees, and he returns to Halloween Town to sort of tell everyone about it, but people can't wrap their heads around it. The one thing they can relate to is a character they misunderstand as a red lobster-like king who flies at night named Sandy Claus. That's so much fun. I mean, so was that element already in, and sort of it must have been just so fun to kind of work with that material and write around that idea?
It was fun. Yeah. Now, and as I said, all the songs but Sally's songs were written before I got there. So Sandy Claus certainly was there. I can remember Danny bringing me into his studio after coming up with that lyric, and, the delight that he felt was palpable.
Jack then sort of locks himself away in his tower to study Christmas and understand it. And he sort of ultimately sort of decides that this isn't fair. Christmas Town shouldn't be able to enjoy the holiday all by itself. And he kind of launches the residents of Halloween Town into this sort of takeover of Christmas, which is such a tantalizing setup for the rest of the film. We then sort of move into the second act. This is sort of the part of films and the part of screenplays that are sort of traditionally known as the hardest to write. Is this where some of the problems were when you came on board?
It's funny. Often I have been asked to be on panels at writers' conferences, and I always let everybody else speak first, because most of them have a programmatic view of writing a screenplay. This the first act turn, the midpoint, the second act turn. I'm the daughter of a lawyer who I think he used to try to pull that dumb country hick lawyer act. And on the stage, I emulated that. And so when it would become my turn to speak, I'd go, golly, you fellas are smart. I don't know what you're talking about. I just write. And that's actually the truth, that I don't know anything about that stuff. I go with my intuition and my gut. And so when a shift is required in the storytelling, it occurs because I felt it needed to happen, not because I knew it needed to happen. So it's
quite instinctual.
Yeah, that's a really hard question for me to answer, because it's all instinct. And I don't, I'm not proud of that, but because I would, it'd be much more comforting to have a system, but that's the way I work.
It works. So Jack assigns the citizens of Halloween Town Christmas-themed jobs, including singing carols, making presents, and building a sleigh to be pulled by skeletal reindeer. Sally experiences a vision that their efforts will end in disaster, but Jack dismisses this and assigns her the task of sewing him a red coat to wear. He also tasks Lock, Shock and Barrel, a trio of mischievous trick-or-treating children, to abduct Santa Claus and bring him back to Halloween Town. And then sort of as the film goes on, we're slowly but surely introduced to Oogie Boogie, who's another of the film's kind of real memorable characters. As you mentioned, like, that character was already in place before you got there. But what was your first reaction to that character?
The Oogie Boogie character looks like a Klansman. I don't know if you know what the Ku Klux Klan is, but they would dress in white sheets that kind of had peaks and attack African Americans and burn crosses on their lawns and hang them from places. Oogie Boogie is a derogatory term for African Americans in the American South. I begged the powers that be to change something about that character because of that. I said, this is so ugly and so dangerous and so antithetical to everything inside me, but I did not win that fight. So he was called Oogie Boogie. He looks like a Ku Klux Klanman. I did not remember this, but somebody recently reminded me that at one point, Henry Selick and Tim had a giant fight over Oogie Boogie where Henry, and I don't remember this at all, but wanted the reveal inside Oogie Boogie to be Dr. Finkelstein manipulating Oogie Boogie rather than the sack of moths and stuff. Apparently, Tim, rather than have a conversation, just flipped out and kicked a hole in the wall and walked out of the room. Didn't want to do that. I did not hear about that until quite recently, to be honest. Though there is a little niggling memory somewhere in there about a confrontation. So it was a troubling part of the film for me, to be perfectly frank. Plus, his song is sung by a black man. So it's like a trifecta of wrongness to me. Yeah. And as I said, I really did beg, I guess it was Tim, because maybe it was Henry and Tim, to just like reconsider, particularly the name, the Boogeyman, Oogie Boogie. I mean, literally that is an Old South. I'm from DC, which is on the cusp of the South of America. Mm-hmm. It's a really evil derogatory term. So,
gosh, wow, I had absolutely no idea of that dimension to it.
Yeah. So, but that's not a fight I won, and I think it's a fun segment of the story as it was executed, but it is a troubling one for me.
So Jack ultimately ends up killing Oogie Boogie, and he apologized.
Killing him is pretty strong.
Well, yes. He then apologizes to Santa for his actions, and Santa's kind of still mad at Jack for ruining Christmas and for not listening to Sally's warnings, but he kind of assures him that he can fix things, and they return to Christmas Town. As Santa replaces the Halloween-style presents with genuine ones, the townspeople of Halloween Town celebrate Jack's survival and return. Santa then visits Halloween Town and brings them a snowfall for residents to play with, which in a way fulfills Jack's original dream. So snow is something...
that sounds like it was my idea, the snowfall. I did that at the end of Edwards Scissorhands as well.
That's what I was going to ask. It obviously kind of it's a motif that pops up a fair bit in your work. What does it represent to you? Because here it sort of feels like, sort of purity and release. Why use that as a payoff in both films?
I don't know. Snowfall is magical. When I grew up in the 60s, strangely, there was a decade of warmth in the mid-Atlantic region in America. So a snowfall was very, very rare and a cause for celebration. And I didn't even have a winter coat. I had sort of a spring weight coat. I mean, that's how warm that decade was. So that's probably something that's going on in my mind. And of course, since I moved to California, which is now 40 plus years ago, and Southern California, one doesn't see snowfall here So I think it sort of resonates for me as sort of a magical transition into some other world.
And you mentioned that earlier that the ending was a bit of a bone of contention for some people. Can you remember why that was and sort of what some of the other avenues almost explored were?
Well, I don't know that it was a bone of contention for people other than myself. I just felt that I wimped out on Sally at the end, to be honest. I felt like that's where I kind of threw her under the bus as a less than character, where she was sort of, enmeshed and enslaved in her adoration for Jack. And I wouldn't have used those words at the time, but in retrospect, I think that's what I was feeling. And I don't know what I found myself still dreaming about what an alternate ending might have been, but I can't put my finger on it. Couldn't put it at the time. As I said, I didn't get the chance really to explore it. So it was just a feeling of having let her down.
Is there ever the temptation to, because there's still so much love for this film, and the question of a sequel comes up, pretty occasionally. Are you ever tempted to sort of right that wrong, return to that character and do a sort of spin-off of sorts where you sort of give Sally the sort of ending that you weren't able to give her with this film?
That's a great idea. It's not really in my, I'm not privileged to be in a position to suggest a sequel. And so I've never really thought about it because I'm a pragmatic person. And so if it's not going to happen, I'm not going to torture myself. But that's a great idea.
If there ever was to be a sequel, which doesn't seem to be something that, anyone involved is particularly interested in, is it something you would kind of want to be a part of? Has the conversation ever arisen?
Writers are often left out of things, and it really was a break in my relationship with Tim, and it's not really been repaired, that relationship. And Henry Selick, the director, it was only years later he apologized to me for telling me, screaming at me that I had ruined his movie. That said, I'm glutton for punishment. I'd probably the idea, but it has not come up as far as I know. And if it has, it hasn't included me. I mean, I wasn't even. I think they made some kind of 3D iteration of the film, and I wasn't even invited to the premiere screening in LA. I didn't even know it existed until after. I mean, literally, that's how deep the break apparently went.
Wow. You can pretty comfortably point to all the continued adoration of the film and all these people around the world who love this character and love the film as a whole as evidence that I don't think you did ruin the film.
No, Henry took it back. He had a much harder time as a filmmaker after that, and saw, that my contribution was positive. Do
you think you'll watch it again this festive period? Is that something you tend to do, or does it bring back too many painful memories? Neither,
actually. I don't really watch my own movies. I know them very deeply because I wrote them. Occasionally I show Homeward Bound to little kids because it so works in a very clean way, and it is the only one of my films at which I regularly cry. It was filmed by such a clever director who was trained as an editor that I don't know if you know that film, but when the old dog comes over the hill at the end, waiting for him is endless. And it makes me bawl every time. It's so stupid. I know how it ends. I wrote it. That's a movie I've seen a few times, not a lot, but the other films I haven't. I really just, I don't feel driven to watch them again.
There will be plenty of people who are watching it for you, so you don't need to worry about that. Caroline, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's been my pleasure, Al. I do, as I said, I hope that your audience enjoys a little bit of a different angle on the story.
You've been listening to Script Apart, hosted by me, Al Horner, produced by Kamil Demek, with music from Stefan Bindley-Taylor. Get in touch. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, or you can email us, thescriptapartpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.